Welcome to the channel Vitamin Stories. Today's story takes us to the year 1849 to the life of Thomas Wiggins, a black boy. Born blind into slavery who could sit at a piano and play with the brilliance of Mozart, yet never spoke a single word his entire life. People called it a miracle. They called him a genius. They paid fortunes to watch him perform. But behind the applause, behind the standing ovations, and the tears of amazement, there was a darker truth no one wanted to face. Thomas Wiggins earned millions of dollars in his lifetime. He performed before presidents and kings. He was called the greatest musical prodigy America had ever produced. And he died alone, penniless, in an asylum, having never owned a single thing, not even himself. This is a difficult and intense story. It's a story about genius and exploitation, about freedom that existed only on paper, about a legal system that found new ways to enslave even after slavery was abolished. So take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss these important stories. And tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. New York City, December 1863. Inside the Grand Concert Hall on Broadway, 3,000 people had gathered. This wasn't just any audience. These were New York's elite. Wealthy merchants sat in the orchestra section. Politicians and newspaper editors filled the boxes. European visitors who had heard rumors of America's musical miracle had traveled specifically for this event. The advertisements had promised something extraordinary, something impossible. And they had paid premium prices, some as much as $2 per ticket, an enormous sum in 1863, to see if the claims could possibly be true. The stage was set simply. A single grand piano, polished to perfection, sat under the gas lights. The red velvet curtains framed it like a painting. When the white man in the expensive suit walked onto the stage, the crowd grew quiet. His name was James Neil Bethune, and he was known throughout the country as the owner and manager of the phenomenon they had come to see. Bethune raised his hands, and his voice carried to every corner of the massive hall. Ladies and gentlemen, what you are about to witness has been examined by the finest doctors in America and Europe. It has been tested by the greatest musicians of our time, and yet no one can explain it. Tonight, we will demonstrate abilities that challenge everything we understand about the human mind. He paused, letting the anticipation build. I will now invite any pianist in the audience to come forward and perform a piece of music. Any piece you choose. The more complex, the better. The more obscure, the more impressive the demonstration will be. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was the challenge they had heard about. A distinguished gentleman in the fifth row stood. He was a concert pianist from Boston, classically trained in Vienna, and he approached the stage with visible skepticism. He sat at the piano, and after a moment's thought began to play a newly composed etude by Franz Liszt, one of the most technically demanding pieces in existence. Rapid scales, thundering bass notes, delicate trills. It lasted nearly 13 minutes. When he finished, he stood and bowed to polite applause, then looked at Bethune with an expression that said clearly, "Let's see your miracle match that." Bethune smiled and gestured toward the wings of the stage. "I present to you Blind Tom." The figure that emerged from the shadows made the audience gasp. He was small, 14 years old, but looking younger. His skin was dark, and his eyes were closed, covered by the thick, milky cataracts of someone born completely blind. He walked with an unusual gait, his head bobbing slightly, his hands fluttering at his sides in repetitive motions. He made soft sounds as he walked, humming notes that seemed disconnected from any melody. His body rocked as he moved, a constant swaying motion that never quite stopped. Some women in the audience looked away. A few men shook their heads. This boy was clearly damaged, clearly mentally deficient. The sight of him was uncomfortable, almost disturbing. Several people began to whisper, began to rise from their seats, ready to demand their money back. This was a cruel joke. This boy could barely walk properly. How could he possibly? Thomas reached the piano bench without any guidance. His hands found the instrument as if magnetized to it. He sat down, adjusted his position with small, precise movements, and placed his fingers on the keys. The concert hall fell completely silent. And then Thomas began to play. What came from that piano in the next 13 minutes was impossible. He played the Liste Etude back. Exactly, note for note. Every rapid scale, every thundering chord, every delicate trill. His blind fingers flew across the keys with speed and precision that seemed superhuman. But it wasn't just accurate, it was perfect. The dynamics, the phrasing, the subtle touches of the pedal. Everything the Boston pianist had played, Thomas reproduced with mechanical exactness. But there was something more. Something that made the audience lean forward, made them forget to breathe. There was emotion in his playing. Depth. Soul. As if the music wasn't coming from his hands, but from some place deep inside him, some place that understood things he could never speak. When he finished, the silence was profound. 3,000 people frozen in disbelief. And then the hall exploded. Men leaped to their feet, shouting. Women wept openly, dabbing their eyes with handkerchiefs. The applause was deafening, rolling like thunder through the concert hall. Some people were calling it a miracle. Others whispered about supernatural forces. The Boston pianist stood at the side of the stage, his face pale, his hands shaking. The newspapers the next day would call Thomas Wiggins the greatest musical genius America had ever produced. They would describe his performance as proof of divine intervention. They would say that his abilities transcended human understanding. But none of them would ask the question that should have been asked. Where did the money go? Who benefited from this miracle? Because Thomas Wiggins, sitting on that stage blind and unable to speak, unable to even understand what was happening, would not see a single penny from that night's performance. Not from the $3,000 in ticket sales, not from the interviews Bethune would sell to newspapers, not from anything. James Bethune would collect it all. Because according to the law, even though slavery had been abolished, Thomas Wiggins still belonged to him. How was that possible? How could a boy be free according to the Constitution but enslaved in every way that mattered to understand that we need to go back? Back 14 years. Back to the beginning. Back to a moment that should have been joyful, but was shadowed by darkness from the very start. May 25, 1849. A slave cabin on the Wiley Edward Jones plantation in Harris County, Georgia. The cabin was small, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with walls made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. The floor was packed dirt. There was no window, just cracks between the logs that let in slivers of light during the day and cold drafts at night. The air inside was stifling thick with the smell of sweat and fear and the worn wood of walls that had housed too many stories of suffering. A woman named Charity was in labor. She was 23 years old, though she looked older. Slavery had a way of aging people fast. She had been blind since birth, born with the same thick cataracts that covered her eyes like clouds. In the brutal hierarchy of plantation slavery, this made her nearly worthless. Blind slaves couldn't pick cotton efficiently, couldn't work in the fields without constant supervision. Charity could only perform the simplest tasks: sorting by touch, cleaning, basic kitchen work. Her husband Mingo stood outside the cabin, not allowed inside during the birth. That was the custom. He pressed his ear to the door, listening to Charity's labored breathing, her occasional cries of pain. He was terrified. They both were. Because they knew what happened to babies born to slaves who were already considered defective. The baby came in the early morning hours, delivered by an elderly slave woman who served as the plantation's unofficial midwife. The moment the child entered the world, the midwife's face fell. The baby didn't cry the way babies should cry. His eyes didn't open. When she held him up to the lamplight, she could see the milky film over both eyes, the same cataracts his mother had. Another blind baby. She wrapped him quickly, her hands shaking, and placed him in Charity's arms. Charity couldn't see her son, but she could feel him. Could feel the strange stillness in his small body, the way he seemed somehow disconnected, as if he wasn't quite present in the moment. "What is it?" Charity whispered, her voice hoarse. Is he whole?" The midwife didn't answer right away. She knew what this meant, knew what would happen when Master Jones found out. "He's blind," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like you, Charity. He's blind." Charity held her baby closer, tears running down her face. Not tears of joy, tears of fear, because she knew. In 1849, Georgia, a blind slave baby wasn't just unfortunate. He was a liability, a mouth to feed that would never produce value. And Wiley Edward Jones was not a patient man, not a kind man. He was a businessman who had built his wealth on the backs of people he considered property, and property that couldn't work was property that needed to be disposed of. When Master Jones learned about the baby 2 days later, his reaction was exactly what Charity had feared. "Blind," he said, standing in the doorway of the slave cabin, looking down at the infant with undisguised disgust. "Another blind one. What use is that to me?" Charity held her baby tighter, saying nothing. She had no words that would matter, no plea that would change his mind. Jones shook his head. "I can't afford to feed useless mouths. The mother's barely worth keeping as it is." He looked at his overseer, a hard-faced man named Taylor, who carried a whip on his belt. "We'll see if anyone wants to buy them cheap. A blind woman and a blind baby. Sell them as a pair. Someone might take them for practically nothing." Taylor nodded. And if no one, Will Jones's silence was answer enough. There were ways to solve problems like this on plantations, ways that didn't require buyers. Charity understood. She held her son and wept silently, rocking him gently, singing to him in a voice so soft only he could hear. She had named him Thomas. Thomas Green Wiggins, taking the name of a nearby plantation owner in the desperate, futile hope that somehow someday a better name might protect him. But names don't protect slaves. And hope on a Georgia plantation in 1849 was a luxury few could afford. Thomas should have died. In a rational world, in a world that followed the cruel logic of slavery, he would have died. Sold for pennies, or worse, simply eliminated as unprofitable. But Thomas had something no one could see yet. Something that would save his life, and ultimately destroy it. 18 months passed. Against all odds, Thomas was still alive. Jones had tried to sell Charity and her baby, but no one wanted them. Even at bargain prices, even offered practically free, no plantation owner saw value in a blind woman and her blind child. So they stayed permitted to exist only because getting rid of them would have been more trouble than letting them live. Thomas was a strange baby, even stranger than his blindness would suggest. He didn't respond to voices the way other babies did, didn't reach for his mother, didn't cry for food or attention in normal ways. He would sit for hours perfectly still, rocking slightly, his small body moving to rhythms that only he could sense. When he did make sounds, they weren't words. They were echoes, repetitions of noises he'd heard, the creak of a door, the rhythm of footsteps, the call of a bird. He would hear something once and repeat it back perfectly, mimicking the pitch and tone. The other slaves whispered about him. Some said he was touched by God. Others said he was simple, born without a full mind. Charity didn't know what to think. She just held him, loved him, and prayed that somehow he would be allowed to live. Then came the day that changed everything. In 1850, wily Edward Jones sold his plantation. The buyer was a man named James Neal Bethune, a lawyer and newspaper editor who had recently inherited money and decided to try his hand at plantation ownership. Bethune was different from Jones. Educated, cultured. He brought something unusual to his new Georgia plantation: a piano. It was a beautiful instrument shipped all the way from Philadelphia. Bethune's daughters practiced on it every afternoon, their stumbling fingers working through scales and simple melodies. The sound carried through the open windows of the main house, drifting across the grounds. And Thomas heard it. For the first time in his young life, something penetrated the fog that seemed to surround him. He stopped rocking, stopped making his repetitive sounds. His entire body went still, oriented toward the music, like a flower turning toward the sun. The house slaves noticed immediately. They whispered about it to each other, about the blind baby who would stand motionless in the yard whenever the piano played, his head tilted, his whole being focused on the sound with an intensity that was almost frightening. When the music stopped, Thomas would wail. Not his usual inarticulate sounds, but something different, desperate, the sound of something precious being taken away. One of the house slaves, an older woman named Martha, told Charity about it. "Your boy, he knows that music. Don't ask me how, but he knows it. He listens like he understands every note." Charity didn't know what to make of this. How could her baby, barely 2 years old, unable to see or speak, understand music? But Martha was insistent. "You should see him, Charity. The way he stands there. It ain't natural. It's like this music is speaking to him in a language the rest of us can't hear." Word reached Bethune. He was intrigued, curious. Here was a boy who seemed unable to connect with the human world at all, yet responded to music with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He made a decision that would determine the course of Thomas's entire life. "Let him come near the house," Bethune told his overseer. "I want to observe him. I want to see this for myself." And observe he did. What he saw would convince him that Thomas Wiggins wasn't worthless after all. In fact, Thomas might be the most valuable thing Bethune would ever own. For 2 years, Thomas was allowed to linger near the main house whenever Bethune's daughters practiced piano. He would stand outside sometimes for hours, perfectly still, except for that constant, gentle rocking. His blind face turned toward the window, absorbing every note. Bethune watched this strange ritual with growing fascination. He was an educated man, had read about cases of unusual mental abilities, but he'd never witnessed anything like this. A boy who seemed unable to perform the simplest tasks of daily life, who couldn't feed himself properly or dress without help, who had never spoken a single word, yet who responded to music with more focus and intensity than Bethune had seen in any trained musician. But Thomas was never allowed inside, never allowed to touch the piano. He was still a slave, after all, still property. The fact that Bethune hadn't sold him was already extraordinary. The breakthrough came on a spring night in 1853. Thomas was 4 years old. Bethune and his family had retired early that evening. The house grew dark and quiet. The slaves had returned to their cabins. Everything was still. And Thomas, who had been waiting, who had perhaps been waiting his entire life for this moment, made his move. How he found his way into the house, nobody ever discovered. How his blind feet navigated the unfamiliar halls, avoided the furniture, located the piano room in complete darkness. These are questions that have no answers. But somehow, in the deep hours of the night, Thomas found himself standing before the piano. His small hands reached out, touched the keys, and then he began to play. Not random notes, not the chaotic banging of a child. He played a melody, complex, sophisticated. A piece he'd heard Bethune's daughter practicing for weeks, a sonata by Mozart that had challenged her considerably. Thomas played it perfectly. The sound woke Bethune. He came downstairs in his nightclothes, carrying an oil lamp, expecting to find an intruder, or perhaps one of the house slaves stealing. Instead, he found a 4-year-old blind boy seated at his piano, playing with the skill and expression of someone who had studied for years. Bethune stood frozen in the doorway, the lamp trembling in his hand. Thomas didn't notice him. Thomas was somewhere else, entirely lost in the music, his body swaying, his face transformed from its usual blank expression into something almost ecstatic. The piece ended. For a moment, there was silence. Then Bethune finally found his voice. "How?" he whispered. "How did you learn that Thomas didn't answer? Couldn't answer?" He had never spoken. But Bethune didn't need an answer. He understood in that moment something profound. This boy, who the world had written off as worthless, who couldn't perform the simplest tasks of daily life, possessed a gift that Bethune had never encountered in his 40 years on Earth. Bethune walked closer, his mind racing. He sat down on a chair near the piano. "Tom," he said, using a shortened name, because the boy's full name seemed too grand for a slave. "Tom, can you play something else? Something you've heard?" Thomas tilted his head as if considering. Then his hands moved to the keys again. He played a hymn that had been sung in church the previous Sunday. Then a folk song he'd heard slaves singing in the quarters. Then another piece from Bethune's daughter's practice session. Each piece perfect. Each one played as if Thomas had the sheet music in front of him, though he couldn't see, and had never been taught to read a single note. Bethune sat there until dawn, testing the boy, playing pieces himself, and watching as Thomas immediately reproduced them, singing melodies and hearing Thomas play them on the piano, describing musical patterns in words, and watching as Thomas translated them into sound. By the time the sun rose, James Bethune had made a decision. The next day, Bethune formally purchased Thomas and his mother, Charity, from the Jones estate, which still technically owned them. The price was negligible, practically nothing. Jones, now living in Alabama, was happy to be rid of them. A blind woman and her blind, mute son. What use were they to anyone? Bethune paid the money and signed the papers with a smile on his face. He called Charity to the main house and explained the situation. "I've bought you and your son," he said. "You'll stay here on my plantation. Tom will be trained in music. He'll be cared for. fed properly, clothed. You have my word. Charity, standing before this white man, who now owned her child completely, didn't know what to say. Should she be grateful? Relieved, terrified. Master Bethune, she finally said, her blind eyes pointed somewhere past his shoulder. What do you want with my boy? Bethune's smile widened. I'm saving him, Charity. I'm giving him a chance to use his gift. Without me, Tom would die. You know that. On another plantation with another owner, he'd be worthless. I see his value. I'll protect him. It all sounded so reasonable, so benevolent. And in a way, Bethune was telling the truth. He was saving Thomas's life. He was giving him opportunities that no other enslaved child could dream of. But there was another truth, one that Bethune didn't say out loud, one that would take years to fully reveal itself. Bethune had just acquired the most valuable asset he would ever own. A money-making machine wrapped in the body of a 4-year-old blind boy. A commodity that would generate wealth beyond his wildest imagination. The question that would haunt Thomas's entire life was this: is there really any difference between being saved and being owned, between protection and possession, between opportunity and exploitation? Thomas couldn't ask these questions. He couldn't speak at all, but his life would answer them in the most heartbreaking way possible. James Bethune wasn't a musician. He recognized Thomas's extraordinary gift, but he didn't know how to develop it properly. So he did what wealthy men do. He hired an expert. Perry Oliver arrived at the Bethune plantation in the fall of 1853. He was a trained pianist and music teacher from Savannah, well-educated in classical technique, with a reputation for working with talented students. When Bethune first wrote to him describing a 4-year-old blind slave boy who could play complex pieces after hearing them, once Oliver was deeply skeptical. It sounded like a fantasy, like the exaggeration of a proud owner boasting about his property. Then Oliver met Thomas. Bethune arranged a demonstration. Oliver sat at the piano in the main house parlor and performed a complex etude by Frédéric Chopin, a piece he'd spent months perfecting, filled with rapid passages and intricate fingerwork that challenged even professional pianists. When Oliver finished, Bethune gestured to Thomas, who had been sitting in the corner rocking gently, seemingly paying no attention. "Tom, can you play what Mr. Oliver just played?" Thomas stood, walked to the piano, with that unusual shuffling gait, his hands fluttering, his head bobbing. Oliver watched with a mixture of pity and doubt. This boy was clearly damaged, clearly simple-minded. The idea that he could... Thomas placed his hands on the keys and played the Chopin etude back. Perfectly. Note for note, exactly as Oliver had played it, including a small error Oliver had made in the 17th measure. Oliver's mouth fell open. He stood up, walked closer to Thomas, studying him as if he were some kind of impossible machine. "My God," he whispered. "How is this possible?" Bethune smiled. "That's what I'm paying you to figure out. I want you to train him, develop his abilities, make him into something the world has never seen before." Over the following months, Perry Oliver came to understand the true extent of Thomas's abilities, and what he learned both amazed and disturbed him. Thomas's memory wasn't just good, it was eidetic, photographic in its completeness. He could hear a piece of music once, no matter how long or complex, and it was permanently recorded in his mind like a wax cylinder recording sound. 10 minutes long, 20 minutes. It didn't matter. His mind captured it perfectly and completely. But there was more. Thomas didn't just mimic, he understood music in a way that seemed to transcend normal human learning. He grasped harmony instinctively, as if the mathematical relationships between notes were visible to him in ways they weren't to others. He could hear a melody once and immediately improvise variations, changing keys, altering rhythms, adding counterpoint, all without any formal training in musical theory. Oliver tried to teach him conventional music theory, tried to explain scales and chords and musical structure through language and description. But Thomas didn't need these lessons. He already knew. Not through study, but through some direct channel to the essence of music itself. He doesn't learn music the way other people learn it, Oliver told Bethune one evening. Music isn't something external to him that he has to study and memorize. Music is his native language. He speaks it more fluently than he'll ever speak English. In fact, I don't think he experiences the world the way we do at all. I think music is how he understands reality. Indeed, Thomas still didn't speak, still rocked and hummed and moved in those strange, repetitive patterns, still needed help dressing, eating, performing basic tasks. Away from the piano, he seemed lost in his own world, disconnected from everything around him. But when his fingers touched the piano keys, he was more articulate than any orator, more expressive than any poet, more present than he ever was in normal life. By the time Thomas was 5 years old, his repertoire included over 100 complete pieces. Classical compositions by Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, Handel, popular songs of the day, dance tunes, church hymns. Anything he heard, even once, became part of his permanent collection, filed away in that extraordinary mind with perfect fidelity. Oliver was astounded, but he was also troubled, because he saw the way Bethune looked at Thomas, not as a child, not as a student to be nurtured and protected, but as an investment, a resource to be developed and exploited. James Oliver said carefully one evening after a particularly long training session, "The boy needs rest. He needs time to be a child, time to play, to develop normally. You're pushing him too hard." Bethune smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Perry, you don't understand. Thomas isn't like other children. Music is what he wants, what he needs. We're not pushing him, we're giving him purpose. We're allowing him to do what he was born to do." Oliver wanted to argue, wanted to point out that Thomas was still a slave, that he had no choice in any of this, that purpose was just another word for use, that no matter how talented Thomas was, he was still a 5-year-old child who deserved childhood. But Oliver was being paid well for his services. Very well. And in 1854 Georgia, the rights and welfare of a slave child were not something white men typically debated, even when they knew something was wrong. So Oliver taught, and Thomas learned, and Bethune planned for the debut that would change everything. October 1854, Columbus, Georgia. The advertisement appeared in the local newspaper, modest but intriguing concert performance by the blind Negro boy, Tom, a musical prodigy unlike any the world has witnessed. Tickets were inexpensive. Bethune wasn't charging much yet. This was a test, a trial run to see if his investment would pay off, to gauge public reaction. The venue was a small hall that seated perhaps 150 people. Even so, Bethune wasn't certain it would fill. Who wanted to watch a 5-year-old blind slave child play piano? It sounded more like a circus sideshow than a legitimate musical event. But curiosity is a powerful draw. Word had spread through Columbus about the blind boy at the Bethune plantation, about his impossible abilities. By the evening of the performance, every seat was taken with people standing in the back and crowding near the doors. Thomas was led onto the stage. He was small, dressed in clean but simple clothes that clearly marked him as a slave. His eyes were closed, covered by those thick, milky cataracts. He walked with that unusual gait, his hands moving in those repetitive patterns that some in the audience found unsettling. Some people laughed nervously. Others whispered to each other. Many doubted this would be anything more than a disappointing fraud. Bethune stood at the front of the stage and addressed the crowd with the confidence of a showman. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried to every corner of the hall, "what you are about to witness may seem impossible. This boy has never been taught music formally. He cannot see the keys he plays. He cannot read a single note of written music. Yet I assure you his abilities will astound you." He gestured to a man in the front row. "Sir, do you play piano?" A portly gentleman stood. "I do, sir. Would you come forward and play something for us? Anything you like. The more complex and unfamiliar, the more impressive the demonstration will be." The gentleman approached with obvious skepticism written on his face. He sat at the piano, thought for a moment, then began to play an obscure sonata by Domenico Scarlatti. It was a challenging piece full of rapid passages and unexpected harmonies. The man played it competently, though not perfectly, making small errors that most people in the audience wouldn't catch. When he finished, Bethune touched Thomas's shoulder gently. "Tom, can you play that for us?" Thomas walked to the piano. The audience leaned forward. This was the moment of truth. He sat down, placed his hands on the keys, and played. Every note the gentleman had played, including the mistakes, including the slight hesitation in the third measure where the man's fingers had fumbled. It was perfect mimicry, like a mirror reflecting sound. The audience gasped, but Bethune held up his hand. "Tom," he said, "now play it correctly." And Thomas did. He played the piece again, but this time without the errors, his small fingers navigating the complex passages with ease, his blind face turned slightly upward, as if reading music from an invisible score floating in the air. The audience erupted. They wanted more. So Thomas played more. Mozart, Beethoven, a Stephen Foster tune that was popular that year. A hymn someone in the audience hummed to test him. Each piece perfect, each performance utterly astonishing. By the end of the evening, people were standing and cheering. Some women wept. Men shook their heads in disbelief. They had witnessed something they couldn't explain, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the limitations of the human mind, especially the mind of a Negro slave child. The local newspaper's review appeared 2 days later. The headline read, "A Miracle of Nature, the blind slave boy who plays like the angels themselves. Blind Tom." That's what they were calling him now. Just Blind Tom, as if he didn't have a full name, as if his identity began and ended with his disability and his ability to perform. And James Bethune, standing in the wings counting the evening's receipts, was already planning the next performance, the next town, the next state, the next fortune to be made. Thomas was no longer just a curiosity. He was a phenomenon, a money-making machine that would never wear out, never complain, never demand a fair share. But as the applause faded and the crowds dispersed into the Georgia night, one question lingered. A question nobody was asking. Does Thomas understand what's happening to him? Does he comprehend that he's being displayed, used, turned into a spectacle? Or is he simply being moved from performance to performance like a chess piece in a game he cannot see and did not choose to play? The answer, if Thomas could give it, might break your heart. Because Thomas, at 5 years old, was already trapped. Trapped by his genius. Trapped by his disabilities. trapped by a system that saw him not as a child to be protected, but as a product to be marketed. And the trap was only beginning to close. The years between 1855 and 1860 were a blur of constant performances. Bethune took Thomas on tour throughout the American South, traveling from town to town, state to state, building a reputation that would eventually spread across the entire nation. Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee. Everywhere they went, the pattern was the same. Bethune would arrive in a town days before the performance, placing advertisements in local newspapers, spreading word through churches and social clubs. He developed a genius for promotion, crafting descriptions that were just sensational enough to draw crowds without seeming like outright lies. "The wonder of the age," the advertisements proclaimed. "The blind Negro boy, whose musical powers defy scientific explanation. Examined by doctors, tested by the finest musicians, certified as authentic by men of science." The shows themselves followed a formula that Bethune perfected over time. He would walk onto the stage alone, first well-dressed, articulate, presenting himself as a man of education and refinement. He would tell the audience about Thomas, about his blindness, his inability to speak, his apparent mental deficiencies in every area except music. This setup was crucial. Bethune understood that the more damaged Thomas appeared, the more miraculous his musical abilities would seem. He wasn't just presenting a talented child. He was presenting an impossibility, a puzzle that challenged everything the audience believed about race intelligence and the nature of human ability. Then Thomas would be led out, and the gasps would begin. Because Thomas looked exactly as Bethune had described. Small for his age, blind, moving in that strange, unsettling way, rocking, humming, flapping his hands, every behavior that marked him as different, as damaged as someone who shouldn't be capable of what he was about to do. The demonstrations varied, but always included the same key elements. Thomas would play classical pieces from memory. He would listen to audience members play and reproduce their performances perfectly. He would play two different pieces simultaneously, one hand playing a melody, while the other played something completely different. He would play pieces backwards, starting from the end and working toward the beginning. And always the audiences would react the same way. Shock, disbelief, wonder, and then thunderous applause. The money poured in. On a good night, in a decent-sized town, a single performance could generate $50 to $100, an enormous sum in the 1850s. In larger cities, the take could be even higher. Bethune was becoming wealthy, very wealthy. Thomas, of course, saw none of this money. He was fed, clothed, and housed. But the hundreds of thousands of dollars his performances generated went entirely into Bethune's pockets. This was legal, normal, expected. Thomas was a slave. The product of his labor, no matter how extraordinary, belonged to his owner. But there were costs beyond the financial. Thomas was still a child, just 6, 7, 8 years old during these early tours. He needed rest, stability, normal childhood experiences. Instead, he spent his days traveling in uncomfortable coaches, sleeping in unfamiliar places, performing night after night under intense pressure and scrutiny. When he wasn't performing, Thomas was often kept isolated. Bethune claimed this was for his protection, that the world was dangerous for a blind boy who couldn't communicate normally. But isolation was also easier than supervision, easier than dealing with Thomas's unusual behaviors and needs. Music remained his only reliable connection to the world outside himself. At the piano, Thomas was alive, present, expressive. Away from it, he retreated deeper into that fog that seemed to surround him, into repetitive behaviors and sounds that others found disturbing or pitiable. As Thomas's fame grew, he began to attract attention from a different audience, scientists and medical professionals who wanted to understand how his mind worked. In 1857, a group of doctors in New Orleans arranged to examine Thomas. Bethune, always eager for publicity and the legitimacy that scientific endorsement would bring, readily agreed. The examination took place over 3 days. Physicians measured Thomas's skull, tested his reflexes, evaluated his responses to various stimuli. They tried to determine his level of intelligence, his cognitive abilities, his capacity for understanding. Their conclusions were contradictory and confusing. In most areas, Thomas appeared to be what they called mentally deficient or idiotic, using the medical terminology of the time. He couldn't answer simple questions, couldn't follow basic instructions, couldn't perform tasks that a normal child of 7 could do easily. By every conventional measure, he appeared to have severe intellectual disabilities. But his musical abilities were not just normal. They were superhuman. His memory for music was perfect and apparently unlimited. His ability to process multiple streams of musical information simultaneously suggested cognitive powers that exceeded those of any normal person. One doctor wrote in his report, "We are confronted with a paradox that challenges our understanding of the human mind. In this boy, we see the coexistence of profound deficiency and extraordinary genius. He is, in most ways, an idiot. Yet in music, he displays abilities that the finest trained musicians cannot match. How can both conditions exist in the same mind?" Another physician proposed that Thomas's brain must be structured differently than normal human brains, that the areas responsible for musical processing were overdeveloped while other areas were underdeveloped or damaged. This was pure speculation, of course. There was no way to examine brain structure in a living person in 1857. What none of these doctors considered, or at least what none of them wrote about, was whether Thomas might have what we would now recognize as autism. The concept didn't exist yet. But Thomas displayed many classic signs: difficulty with verbal communication, repetitive behaviors, intense, focus on specific interests, sensory sensitivities, challenges with social interaction, but extraordinary abilities in particular areas. In the context of slavery and the racist pseudoscience of the 1850s, these doctors were trying to fit Thomas into existing categories and theories about racial inferiority and mental deficiency. They couldn't imagine that his mind simply worked differently, that what appeared to be disability in some areas was inseparably linked to his extraordinary abilities in others. Bethune loved these examinations. Each scientific report, each doctor's testimony to Thomas's authentic abilities was more publicity, more legitimacy, more reason for audiences to pay premium prices. And the doctors, for their part, got to examine a genuine mystery, a case that would be discussed in medical journals and lecture halls for years to come. Nobody asked Thomas what he thought about being measured, tested, and discussed, as if he were a curious specimen rather than a human being. Because Thomas couldn't tell them. And even if he could have, in the America of 1857, the opinions of a slave child didn't matter. Then came 1861, and everything changed. The American Civil War began in April of that year, tearing the nation apart over the question of slavery. For most Americans, the war was a time of choosing sides, of fierce loyalty to either the Union or the Confederacy, of families divided and friendships destroyed. For James Bethune, the war was a business opportunity. Bethune had no strong political convictions beyond protecting his own financial interests. He owned slaves, including Thomas, so theoretically he should have supported the Confederacy's fight to preserve slavery. But Bethune was also a practical man who understood that war created unique opportunities for those willing to set aside ideology in favor of profit. So Bethune made a decision that many found shocking, but which was perfectly logical from his perspective. Thomas would perform for both sides. Confederate officers in Charleston 1 month, Union soldiers in occupied New Orleans the next. It didn't matter which uniform they wore. They all paid. They all needed distraction from the horrors of war. And they all marveled at the blind slave boy who could play anything he heard. There was something particularly grotesque about this. Here was Thomas, a black child, who would be freed if the Union won, who would remain enslaved if the Confederacy prevailed. His entire future, his potential freedom or continued bondage, hung in the balance of this war. Yet he was paraded before both armies like a trained animal generating profit, regardless of which side won, unable to express any preference or understanding of what was at stake. The Confederate audiences saw Thomas as proof that even the Negro race's most gifted individuals were still inferior, still dependent on white ownership and management. Look, they would say, even this genius cannot care for himself, cannot speak, cannot function without a white master to guide him. The Union audiences saw Thomas as evidence of the waste and tragedy of slavery, of talents suppressed and lives constrained by an evil system. Yet they still paid to watch him perform, still treated him as a curiosity, rather than a person, still went home afterward and left him in Bethune's control. During these war years, Thomas was becoming more than just a regional phenomenon. He was becoming a national figure, written about in newspapers across the country, discussed in parlors and meeting halls, his name known to millions who had never seen him perform. And through it all, Thomas played. Night after night, city after city. Confederate gray or Union blue. It made no difference to him. He couldn't see their uniforms anyway. He only heard their applause, felt the vibrations of their feet stamping approval, sensed their presence in the way that blind people sense crowds. Did he understand that men were dying for the question of whether he should be free? Did he comprehend that his own fate was being decided on distant battlefields, in hospitals and prison camps, in the halls of Congress? We don't know. He couldn't speak, couldn't ask questions, couldn't express confusion or fear or hope. He just played, because that's what he'd been trained to do, what he'd been made into. A performance, not a person. Before we move forward to what happened after the war, we need to talk about what many consider the greatest single performance of Thomas's life. An event that took place in early 1860, before the war began, before everything fell apart. An event that proved beyond any possible doubt that Thomas's abilities transcended anything the musical world had ever encountered. It was billed as the Battle of Music, held in a grand theater in New Orleans. The format was brutal in its simplicity. 3 of the finest pianists in the South would each perform their most challenging piece. Thomas would hear each piece once, then play it back. But there was an additional challenge, one that Bethune had promoted heavily in advertisements. After hearing all 3 pieces, Thomas would play them simultaneously, left hand playing one melody, right hand playing another, while singing the third with his voice. It sounded impossible, because it was impossible, for any normal human being. The theater was packed with over 1,000 people. Skeptics came ready to expose a fraud. Believers came to witness a miracle. Musicians came to see if the rumors could possibly be true. Bethune came to collect what would be the largest single-night earnings of Thomas's career to that point. The first pianist was a stern German instructor named Friedrich Braun, who had trained in Leipzig. He chose one of Liszt's transcendental etudes, a piece so technically demanding that most professional pianists would need months to master it. He played with precision and power, his fingers blazing across the keys. Thomas sat in a chair at the side of the stage, his blind eyes closed, his body rocking slightly, looking like he wasn't paying attention at all. Some people in the audience whispered that this was already over, that the boy couldn't possibly. When Braun finished, Thomas stood, walked to the piano, sat down, and played the etude back. Perfectly. Every rapid passage, every thundering chord, every delicate trill. Note for note, dynamic for dynamic. Exactly as Braun had played it. The crowd erupted, but the challenge had only begun. The second pianist was a young woman named Marie Desjardins, trained in Paris, known for her emotional interpretations. She chose a Chopin nocturne, delicate and lyrical, filled with subtle timing variations and expressive rubato that couldn't be taught, only felt. Thomas listened, his face showing no expression. When she finished, he reproduced her performance flawlessly, capturing not just the notes, but the emotion, the subtle timing, the feeling that made her interpretation special. The audience was on its feet now, many already convinced they were witnessing something unprecedented. But the final challenge remained. The third pianist was an older gentleman named Dr. Charles Metz, a composer and music professor who had written an original work specifically for this occasion. It was 20 minutes long, filled with complex polyrhythms, unusual harmonies, sudden key changes, and passages designed to be as difficult as possible to memorize. He had never performed it publicly before. No one else had ever heard it. Thomas sat through all 20 minutes completely still, except for that gentle rocking. When Dr. Metz finished, the theater fell silent. This was it, the impossible test. Thomas stood, walked to the piano, and played all 20 minutes back. Perfectly. The audience thought it was over. They were wrong. Bethune stepped forward and raised his hands for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice ringing through the hall, "Tom will now play all three pieces simultaneously." Impossible, people whispered. Surely impossible. Thomas's hands found the keys. His left hand began playing the Liszt etude, those rapid, complex passages flowing like water. His right hand started the Chopin nocturne, delicate and emotional, existing in perfect harmony with the aggressive left hand. And then he began to sing, not with words, but with pure vocalization, the melody of Dr. Metz's composition. 3 pieces, 3 different keys, 3 different rhythms, 3 different emotional tones, all at once, all perfect. For 5 minutes, Thomas maintained this impossible juggling act, his brain processing 3 completely separate musical streams simultaneously, his hands and voice coordinating in ways that seemed to violate the basic architecture of human neurology. When he finished, the silence was absolute. No one could process what they'd just witnessed. It wasn't just musical genius. It was something else entirely. Something that suggested the human brain, under certain conditions, might be capable of things science couldn't explain. Then the applause came. thunderous, sustained. People rushed the stage. The three challenger pianists stood in shock. Dr. Metz was seen wiping tears from his eyes. Friedrich Braun later wrote that he had witnessed something that made him question everything he thought he knew about music and mind. Bethune collected the enormous prize money and the massive ticket sales. Over $3,000 for a single night of fortune in 1860. Thomas was led off stage, given Water told he had performed well. The prize money, of course, went entirely to Bethune. Thomas received nothing but vague praise and the exhaustion of an 11-year-old boy who had just performed the impossible. But perhaps the saddest part of this triumphant evening wasn't who got the money. It was that Thomas, even in his moment of greatest glory, had no choice but to perform. No option to say no. No ability to understand that he'd just proven himself to be one of the most remarkable musical minds in human history. No way to benefit from his own genius. He was still a slave. And in just 1 year, when the war began, and 5 years after that, when the war ended, he would discover that freedom on paper meant nothing at all when you were blind, unable to speak, and owned by a man who had found a perfectly legal way to keep you enslaved in everything but name. The celebration was about to become something far darker. January 1st, 1863. President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation declaring that all slaves in Confederate states were free. On paper, this meant Thomas Wiggins at age 13 was no longer property. He was a free person with all the rights that freedom supposedly entailed. In reality, nothing changed. Bethune had prepared for this possibility. Even before the war ended, even before emancipation became law, he had been consulting with lawyers, researching legal precedents, finding loopholes that would allow him to maintain control. What he discovered was perfect for his purposes. Many states had laws allowing for the legal guardianship of individuals deemed incompetent or unable to care for themselves. These laws were ostensibly created to protect people with severe mental or physical disabilities. In practice, especially in the years after the Civil War, they became a tool to maintain control over formerly enslaved people, particularly those with disabilities. In 1865, just months after slavery officially ended, Bethune petitioned the court for legal guardianship of Thomas. His argument was straightforward and to the judges convincing. Thomas was blind. He could not speak. He displayed obvious signs of mental deficiency in virtually all areas except music. He could not dress himself properly, could not manage money, could not make basic decisions about daily life. Without a guardian, Bethune argued Thomas would be helpless, vulnerable, likely dead within months. Who better to serve as guardian than Bethune himself? The man who had cared for Thomas since age 4, the man who understood his needs, the man who had protected him and developed his talents. The court agreed. Bethune was appointed Thomas's legal guardian with complete authority over every aspect of his life. On paper, Thomas was free. In practice, he was still owned. The guardianship gave Bethune legal control over where Thomas lived, what he did, and critically who received all the money from his performances. Thomas had gone from being Bethune's slave to being his ward. The words had changed. The reality hadn't. But someone noticed. Someone who had been watching all of this with growing desperation and rage. Charity Wiggins, Thomas's mother. Charity had been freed along with all the other slaves on the Bethune plantation. She was now living in a small cabin on land she rented, supporting herself, through washing and mending clothes. She was still blind, still poor, but she was free. And she wanted her son to be truly free as well. She had watched for years as Bethune toured Thomas across the country and Europe, making a fortune from her child's gifts, while she was kept at a distance, allowed only occasional supervised visits. Now, with slavery ended, she thought things might finally change. They didn't. In 1867, with the help of sympathetic lawyers and members of the black community in Georgia, Charity filed a lawsuit. She petitioned the court to revoke Bethune's guardianship and grant it to her instead. Her argument was simple, and from the heart, she was Thomas's mother. She loved him. She would care for him without exploiting his talents for profit. He belonged with her, not with the man who had enslaved their family. The case went to trial in early 1868, and it became one of the most publicized legal battles of the Reconstruction era. Bethune's lawyers were expensive and skilled. They argued that Charity, though well-meaning, was blind and poor. How could a blind woman with no resources care for a son who needed constant supervision? How could she provide the medical care, the proper housing, the stability that Thomas required? They brought doctors to testify that Thomas needed specialized care that only someone with Bethune's resources could provide. They brought financial records showing how much money Bethune spent on Thomas's care. They painted a picture of Bethune as a benevolent protector and Charity as a loving but unrealistic mother who didn't understand her son's complex needs. Charity's lawyers countered that motherly love and blood relation should supersede financial considerations, that Bethune's guardianship was merely slavery under a different name designed solely to continue profiting from Thomas, that Thomas had a right to be with his family, to live free from exploitation. The trial lasted weeks. Witnesses testified. Doctors examined Thomas again, trying to determine his level of understanding, his ability to express preferences about his own life. At one point, the judge ordered Thomas brought to the courtroom. He wanted to see this young man whose fate everyone was debating. Thomas was 18 years old now, no longer a child. He was led into the courtroom, guided to a chair near the judge's bench. Charity sat across the room, forbidden from approaching him without permission. She couldn't see him, but she knew he was there. Tears ran down her blind face. The judge, a white man in his 60s named Henry Clayton, looked at Thomas with a mixture of fascination and pity. He asked the court to bring in a piano so he could witness Thomas's abilities himself. A small upright piano was wheeled into the courtroom. Thomas was led to it. At Bethune's prompting, he played for 30 minutes. Beethoven, Mozart, Chopin, original improvisations. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, even those who had heard about Thomas's gifts, but never witnessed them. When the music ended, Judge Clayton spoke directly to Thomas. "Thomas," he said slowly, as if speaking to a small child, "do you understand what these proceedings are about? Can you tell the court who you would prefer to live with, your mother or Mr. Bethune?" Thomas sat at the piano, his blind eyes staring at nothing. He rocked slightly, made a humming sound. Then he turned back to the piano and played a sad, slow melody in a minor key that no one in the courtroom recognized. Judge Clayton sighed. He had his answer, or thought he did. The verdict came down in February 1869. The court ruled in Bethune's favor. The judge's reasoning was pragmatic, and by the standards of the time, logical. Bethune had the resources to care for Thomas properly. He had demonstrated years of successful management. Charity, despite her love, simply couldn't provide the same level of care. The unspoken message was clear. Money mattered more than blood. Financial resources trumped parental bonds, and the opinions of a blind, formerly enslaved woman carried no weight against the word of a wealthy white lawyer. Charity left the courtroom in tears. She would see her son only a handful of times over the next 20 years, always at Bethune's discretion, always under his watchful supervision, always with the understanding that these visits were privileges he could revoke at any moment. And Thomas was led back to the hotel, back to the rehearsals, back to the performances, back to the life that had been decided for him by others. He was legally free, practically enslaved, and the worst years were still ahead. In 1866, right after the war ended and right before Charity's lawsuit began, Bethune took Thomas to Europe. This wasn't just about making money, though money was certainly part of it. It was also about removing Thomas from America, from the uncomfortable questions being asked about whether Bethune's control over him was ethical or legal. In Europe, those questions wouldn't follow them. In Europe, Thomas would simply be an American curiosity, a musical phenomenon with no one asking too carefully about the arrangements behind his performances. They toured for 18 months. England, Scotland, France, Germany, Austria, Italy, everywhere they went, Thomas astonished audiences. In London, he performed at the Royal Albert Hall before British aristocracy. The Times of London wrote, "We have witnessed what can only be described as one of nature's most extraordinary manifestations." This young man's abilities challenge our understanding of human potential and raise profound questions about the nature of genius itself. In Paris, he was examined by doctors at the Salpêtrière Hospital, a famous institution for studying neurological conditions. French physicians measured, tested, and evaluated him, producing papers that would be cited in medical journals for decades. Their conclusion mirrored what American doctors had said. Thomas displayed signs of severe mental deficiency in most areas, yet possessed musical abilities that exceeded those of the finest trained musicians in Europe. In Vienna, he played in the same concert hall where Beethoven had premiered symphonies. Austrian musicians, proud inheritors of the classical tradition, approached with skepticism and left humbled. One composer wrote, "Afterward, I created a piece specifically to test this boy, 10 minutes of my most complex work, filled with difficulties that would challenge any professional." He heard it once and played it back, as if he had composed it himself. I am forced to admit that his musical gifts may exceed even those of Mozart at a comparable age. The European tour was a massive financial success. Bethune charged premium prices and played to sold-out venues. By the time they returned to America in late 1867, Bethune had become wealthy beyond his previous imagination. But there was a human cost that nobody in those European audiences saw or cared about. Thomas was 18 years old. He was blind. He couldn't speak. He was completely dependent on Bethune and Bethune's employees for every aspect of his existence. And he was being worked relentlessly. Multiple performances per week. Constant travel between cities. Interviews with journalists and examinations by scientists. Dinners with wealthy patrons, where he was expected to perform parlor tricks, playing whatever people requested, demonstrating his abilities like a trained animal. He had no friends, had no one he could trust or rely on except the people who were using him. No connection to his mother or any other family. No autonomy over even the smallest decisions of his daily life. Thomas's mental state was beginning to show signs of stress. He developed more pronounced tics. His rocking became more violent at times. He would sometimes refuse to eat for days, then gorge himself until he was sick. He would repeat phrases he'd heard, not understanding them, just echoing them endlessly. A few people expressed concern. A doctor in Berlin suggested Thomas needed rest, needed stability, needed time away from performing. Bethune thanked the doctor politely and ignored the advice completely. There were performances scheduled, contracts signed, money to be made. By the time they returned to America, Thomas was exhausted. But instead of rest, he found himself at the center of a legal battle for his freedom that he couldn't understand and couldn't participate in. And when that battle was over, when the court had decided that Bethune would remain his guardian, Thomas's situation didn't improve. It got worse. With the legal battle settled in his favor, Bethune intensified Thomas's performance schedule. The 1870s were the peak of Thomas's fame and the nadir of his quality of life. 300 performances a year, sometimes more. Do the math. That's nearly every single day, accounting for travel time between cities. Think about that for a moment. Imagine performing at the absolute highest level of your abilities under intense scrutiny with thousands of eyes watching you every single day. No breaks, no vacation, no choice in the matter. No days when you're tired or sick or just need to rest. For Thomas, it was even worse. He couldn't see the audiences, but he could sense them, could feel their expectation, their hunger for the impossible. And he delivered. Every night, every performance. Because he didn't know how to say no, and even if he had, it wouldn't have mattered. The routine was punishing. Wake early, travel to the next town, often by uncomfortable coach or train. Arrive at the venue. Rehearse if there was time, though. Thomas rarely needed rehearsal. Perform for 2 or 3 hours. Return to the hotel. Sleep. Wake. Repeat. Thomas was in his 20s now, at the peak of his physical and mental abilities. But the constant performance, the lack of rest, the isolation, the absence of any real human connection beyond the purely transactional, it was taking a toll. Bethune kept Thomas separated from other people as much as possible. He claimed this was for Thomas's protection. A blind, non-speaking man could easily be taken advantage of, Bethune would say. Better to keep him safe, controlled, managed. But the real reason was simpler and more cynical. People who spent time with Thomas might ask questions, might wonder if this arrangement was ethical, might contact authorities or journalists or activists who were starting to pay attention to the treatment of disabled people and former slaves. So Thomas lived in hotel rooms, in the back rooms of theaters, in Bethune's home when not touring but always in separate quarters, always kept apart. He had no friends, no confidants, no one he could trust or communicate with beyond the people who controlled his life. His only real relationship was with music itself. At the piano, Thomas was alive, present, expressive, free in the only way he would ever know freedom. Away from the piano, he retreated deeper into himself, into those repetitive behaviors and self-soothing motions that others found disturbing. In the summer of 1875, something inside Thomas broke. They were in Chicago, scheduled for a week of performances at a prestigious venue. Thomas had been on tour without a break for 7 months straight. He was exhausted, though he couldn't articulate this. He was lonely, though he had no words for that feeling. He was, though he didn't understand it in these terms, depressed. On the night of the first scheduled performance, Thomas refused to come out of his hotel room. The theater manager came to get him. Bethune's assistant tried to coax him out. Finally, Bethune himself arrived, growing increasingly angry as showtime approached, and Thomas remained locked inside, sitting on the floor, rocking violently, making sounds of distress. Tom Bethune said, his voice hard, "There are 800 people waiting. You will perform, now." Thomas didn't respond, didn't move, except for that violent rocking. Bethune tried everything: gentle persuasion, firm commands, threats. Nothing worked. For the first time in his life, Thomas was refusing. Not with words, not with any conscious act of rebellion, but with his entire being, he was saying no. The performance was cancelled, and the next nights, and the one after that. For 3 weeks, Thomas sat in that hotel room, barely eating, rocking, occasionally touching the piano keys in his room, but not really playing, just pressing them softly and listening to the sounds as if they were coming from very far away. Doctors were brought in. They had no answers. They prescribed rest, which Bethune found useless as advice. They suggested that Thomas might be suffering from nervous exhaustion, that he needed time to recover. One doctor, more perceptive than the others, said quietly that Thomas was showing signs of what they called melancholia, what we would now recognize as severe depression. Bethune was furious. He had to cancel performances, refund tickets, disappoint audiences. He was losing money, and in his mind, Thomas was being difficult, willfully disobedient, ungrateful for all the care and opportunities he'd been given. Slowly, over the following weeks, Thomas emerged from this breakdown. The performances resumed, but something had changed. Those who saw Thomas during this period and in the years after reported that he seemed more absent than before, more lost in his own world, more disconnected from everything around him. He still played brilliantly. His abilities hadn't diminished. But there was a quality missing now, some spark that had been present in his younger years. He played like a machine performing its function perfectly, but without joy. And the question haunted everyone who encountered him. How much longer could this continue? How many more years could a human being endure this existence before something inside them broke permanently? September 1883. James Neil Bethune died of a heart attack at age 68. When the news reached Thomas, no one knew how he reacted. He couldn't express grief in conventional ways, but witnesses reported that he stopped playing for 3 days, simply sat at the piano, his hands hovering over the keys, unable or unwilling to press them down. Was he mourning? Or was he experiencing something more complex? Relief mixed with fear. The loss of the only constant in his life, even if that constant had been his captor. For a brief moment, there was hope. Hope that Thomas, now 34 years old, might finally have a chance at something resembling real freedom. Charity Wiggins. Thomas's mother was still alive. She immediately filed a new petition with the court. With Bethune dead, surely now the guardianship would be granted to her. Her son could come home, could live out his years in peace, performing when and if he chose to, resting when he needed to. Finally, after all these years, they could be a family. But James Bethune's wife, Eliza, had other plans. Eliza Bethune was a formidable woman in her early 50s. She had watched her husband build a fortune from Thomas's talents over nearly 30 years, and she had no intention of letting that fortune slip away now. Within weeks of James's death, Eliza petitioned the court for guardianship. Her argument was similar to her late husband's. She had helped manage Thomas for years. She understood his needs and his routines. She could provide the same level of care James had provided. Changing guardians now would be disruptive to Thomas, potentially harmful to his delicate mental state. The legal battle was swift and brutal. Charity had even fewer resources than she'd had in the first trial, 15 years earlier. She was now in her late 50s, still blind, still poor, living in a single room and supporting herself through whatever work she could find. Eliza had money, lawyers, and the institutional inertia of a legal system that had already decided this question once before. In December 1883, just 3 months after James's death, the court ruled. Eliza Bethune was granted full guardianship of Thomas. Charity's last hope died. She tried to see her son. Eliza refused. She wrote letters. They were ignored. She appeared at the courthouse begging for just a few minutes with Thomas. She was turned away. If there had been any hope that Eliza might be kinder than James, that hope died quickly. Eliza was, if anything, more ruthless. She saw Thomas purely as a financial asset. No pretense of affection or care. No claims of protection or benevolence. Just cold, calculated exploitation. She ramped up the performance schedule even further, hired new managers to tour Thomas across the country, pushed him harder than James had ever dared, and she was cruel in smaller ways too. James had at least maintained a facade of paternalistic benevolence, had spoken kindly to Thomas, had treated him with a kind of proprietorial affection. Eliza offered none of that. Thomas was a tool. You don't waste sentiment on tools. The 1880s and 1890s became the darkest period of Thomas's life, and considering everything that had come before, that's saying something. He was touring, constantly performing 300 to 350 times per year. His health was declining. The arthritis in his hands that had begun in his 30s was getting worse. The constant travel and performance were wearing down his body. His performances, while still remarkable, began to show signs of strain. The absolute precision of his youth was still there, but the vitality, the joy that had once infused his playing was fading. He was becoming a tired machine, still functional, but worn. And there was no one to save him. No one with the power or the will to intervene. Charity tried one final time in 1887, filed another petition, begged the court to please let her have her son back. The petition was denied without even a hearing. She died 4 years later in 1891, having spent the last 24 years of her life fighting to free her child, losing every single battle. Thomas never knew she had died. Eliza didn't tell him. Perhaps she thought he wouldn't understand, or perhaps she simply didn't care enough to inform him. And Thomas kept playing, kept performing, because that's what he'd been made into. Not a person, a performance. And performances don't stop just because they're tired or sad or have been playing the same notes for 40 years. They keep going until someone decides they're no longer useful. That decision was coming. And when it came, Thomas would discover something that should have been impossible to discover, that there are things even worse than being exploited. There's being discarded. By the mid-1890s, Thomas Wiggins was in his mid-40s. For a performing musician who had been working without a single break since age 5, this meant his body was decades older than his actual years. His hands, those miraculous hands that had played millions of notes over 4 decades, were betraying him. The arthritis that had started as occasional stiffness had become constant pain. Some mornings Thomas could barely make a fist. His fingers were swollen, the joints inflamed and aching, but Eliza Bethune insisted he perform anyway. The audience couldn't see his pain. They only heard the music. And as long as the music was still there, as long as Thomas could still deliver what they paid for, his suffering was irrelevant. Thomas began making mistakes for the first time in his life. Not often, not many, but they happened. A missed note here, a hesitation there. Tiny errors that most listeners wouldn't catch, that only the most trained ears would notice. But Thomas caught them, and when he made mistakes, he would become agitated, upset in ways he couldn't articulate. He would rock more violently. Sometimes he would stop mid-performance, his hands frozen over the keys, his face showing distress. Then, after a moment, he would start again, as if nothing had happened. The audiences were changing too. In the 1850s and 1860s, Thomas had been a sensation because nothing like him had ever been seen. But by the 1890s, the novelty had faded. There were other performers, other spectacles to capture the public's attention. The blind slave boy who had seemed so remarkable 40 years ago was now just an aging curiosity, a relic of a bygone era. Ticket sales declined, not catastrophically, but noticeably. The venues got smaller, the audiences less prestigious. The newspapers that had once written breathless reviews now barely mentioned his performances. And Eliza Bethune's patience was wearing thin. She had expected Thomas to be a perpetual money machine generating wealth until the day he died. Instead, he was becoming merely profitable, rather than extraordinarily so. His declining abilities and declining audiences meant declining revenue. In Eliza's cold calculation, Thomas was transitioning from asset to liability. The care he required, minimal as it was, felt like an expense she resented. His inability to generate the same income as before made him less valuable. She began to view him not as a source of wealth, but as a burden. In 1898, Thomas became seriously ill with a respiratory infection. For a man his age, in his condition, living the life he'd lived, such an illness could easily prove fatal. Eliza hired a doctor, but the cheapest one she could find. She kept Thomas in a cold, drafty room in the boarding house where they were staying during a tour. She minimized expenses, buying only the most basic medicines. And critically, she began making plans for what she would do when Thomas died. She had already been transferring money from the accounts she controlled into her personal name. She had been selling off assets. She was preparing essentially to abandon Thomas the moment he stopped being useful. Thomas recovered from that illness, though slowly and incompletely. His lungs were permanently weakened. His already fragile health had taken another hit. But Eliza didn't reduce the performance schedule, didn't give him time to fully recover. There were contracts to fulfill, obligations to meet money to be made, while Thomas could still perform. Over the next few years, Thomas's performances became increasingly erratic. Some nights he played brilliantly as if nothing had changed. Other nights he would become confused, disoriented, unable to finish pieces he'd known for decades. The audiences began to dwindle further. Some venues canceled bookings. The once famous Blind Tom was becoming an embarrassment, a sad spectacle of what genius looked like when it was worn down to nothing. The end, when it came, was as cold and calculated as everything else in Thomas's life. In 1905, Eliza Bethune made a decision. Thomas was now 56 years old. His performances were barely profitable. His health was poor. The care he required, though still minimal, was more than Eliza wanted to provide. She decided he was no longer worth the trouble. The official story was that Thomas needed specialized care that Eliza could no longer provide at home. That his mental and physical condition had deteriorated to the point where a private living situation was no longer appropriate. The truth was simpler and crueler. Thomas was now costing more than he was earning. And Eliza Bethune had never kept anything around that didn't turn a profit. In June 1905, Thomas was committed to an asylum. The specific institution's name varies in different historical records, but what's consistent is this. It was a place for people society had deemed unable to care for themselves. A warehouse for the inconvenient, the difficult, the unwanted. Thomas was placed in a room with other patients. There was no piano, no music. The thing that had been his entire life, his only reliable source of joy and expression and connection to the world, was taken away. The staff didn't know who he was. To them, he was just another elderly black patient, blind and non-verbal, who rocked and hummed and needed to be fed and supervised. Just another number in an overcrowded facility. Occasionally, someone would recognize him. A doctor or orderly who remembered the famous blind Tom from decades earlier. They would be shocked to find him here in these conditions, forgotten and abandoned. A few of these people tried to arrange for Thomas to have access to a piano. They thought it might help him, might bring him some comfort or joy in this terrible place. Usually their efforts failed, lost in the bureaucracy and indifference of the institution. On rare occasions, Thomas was allowed to play an old, out-of-tune piano that sat in the asylum's common room. When he did, something remarkable happened. Patients who normally wandered aimlessly or sat in catatonic stillness would stop. They would gather around, sit in silence, listen. Because even now, even with his skills diminished by age and illness, even on a terrible instrument, Thomas could still create beauty, could still take the pain and loneliness and fear that filled that place and transform it into something else, something transcendent, if only for a few minutes. But these moments were rare. Most days, Thomas sat in his room or in the common area, rocked, hummed melodies to himself that only he could hear, lived inside his own mind, in whatever private world he had constructed to escape the one he'd been forced to inhabit. He had gone from performing before 3,000 people in grand concert halls to sitting in an asylum day room with no one paying attention to him at all. From being called the greatest musical genius in America to being a nameless patient in an institution. And the cruelest irony, he was technically finally free. No one owned him anymore. No one controlled his schedule or dictated when he had to perform. He was free to sit in an asylum and slowly fade away, forgotten by the world that had once worshipped him. June 13th, 1908. Thomas Green. Wiggins died in the asylum. He was 59 years old. The cause of death listed on his certificate was general debility, a vague medical term that could mean almost anything. Essentially, his body had simply given up. Worn out by decades of exploitation, weakened by years of decline, worn down to nothing, his heart stopped beating. He died alone. No family at his bedside. His mother Charity had died 17 years earlier, having never been allowed to care for her son. His father Mingo had died even before that. No Bethune family member came to sit with him in his final hours. Why would they? He was no longer profitable. The asylum notified Eliza Bethune of his death. She arranged for the cheapest burial possible. A simple pine coffin. A grave in an unmarked plot in a cemetery for the indigent and forgotten. No funeral service. No memorial. No gathering to honor his life or mourn his passing. A few newspapers ran obituaries. They were brief, often inaccurate, sometimes confused about basic facts of his life. Blind Tom the Negro, musical prodigy, has died, one reported, as if he'd never had a full name, as if his entire identity could be reduced to his disability and his ability to perform. Some obituaries got his age wrong. Others misspelled his name or confused details of his career. One claimed he had died in poverty, which was technically true, though it failed to mention the millions of dollars his performances had generated over 53 years of constant work. There was no public mourning, no concerts held in his memory, no gathering of musicians to honor one of the most extraordinary talents of the 19th century. No acknowledgement of what had been lost. Thomas Wiggins was buried in an unmarked grave and forgotten within a week. His story should have ended there, in silence and obscurity. Another black life, no matter how extraordinary, erased from history as if it had never mattered at all. For the next 50 years, Thomas Wiggins was largely forgotten. His name appeared occasionally in academic papers about musical prodigies or the history of slavery and disability. But these were obscure publications read by a handful of scholars, making little impact on public consciousness. The recordings Thomas had made in the early days of recording technology, precious documents of his actual playing, were lost or misplaced. The sheet music of his original compositions, over 100 pieces he had created, was scattered to the winds, most of it destroyed or simply thrown away as worthless. The first-hand accounts of people who had witnessed his performances faded as those witnesses died. The newspapers and journals that had documented his career were stored in archives where almost no one looked. By the 1950s, most Americans had no idea who Thomas Wiggins was. The man who had once been called the eighth wonder of the world, who had performed before presidents and European royalty, who had been examined by the finest scientists of his era, had been completely erased from collective memory. His grave had no marker, just an unmarked plot in a cemetery that few people visited. Eventually, even the exact location of his burial was forgotten. He was just another body in the ground somewhere, unknown, unclaimed, unmourned. It seemed that Thomas's story would end there, in complete obscurity, a footnote at best in the grand narrative of American history. Another extraordinary black life rendered invisible, another genius whose gifts were exploited and then discarded. But stories sometimes refuse to stay buried. And in the 1960s, as America began to re-examine its history and confront truths it had long ignored, someone started asking questions about the blind slave boy who could play like Mozart. And what they discovered shocked them. The 1960s brought many things to America: the civil rights movement, social upheaval, a nationwide reckoning with racism and injustice. And in this context, historians began looking more closely at stories that had been erased or minimized, Black Americans whose contributions had been forgotten, voices that had been silenced. A historian and musicologist named Geneva Southall became fascinated by a brief reference to Thomas Wiggins she found in an old newspaper. She started digging, tracking down every mention she could find. Court records from the guardianship trials, performance reviews from the 1860s, medical examinations, financial documents, fragmentary accounts from people who had seen him perform. What she discovered shocked and horrified her. Here was a man who had been arguably the most famous musician in America for a significant period of time, who had performed before Abraham Lincoln, before European royalty, before hundreds of thousands of people across 2 continents, who had generated wealth equivalent to tens of millions of dollars in today's money, who had possessed abilities that modern neuroscience still struggles to explain, and he had been completely erased from history. More than that, the story of his life revealed uncomfortable truths about how America had treated its most vulnerable citizens, how legal systems could be manipulated to maintain oppression even after oppression was officially outlawed, how genius could be exploited without shame, how a person could be celebrated as a miracle while being treated as property. Southall began publishing articles. Then in 1979, she published a book, Blind Tom: The Post-Civil War Enslavement of a Black Musical Genius. The title was deliberate, provocative, making crystal clear that what had happened to Thomas wasn't just unfortunate or unfair. It was enslavement continuing long after slavery had legally ended. The book sparked renewed interest. Other researchers followed. More documents were discovered. Some of Thomas's original compositions were recovered from dusty archives in libraries and private collections. A few early recordings preserved on wax cylinders were found and painstakingly digitized. When people heard these recordings, even through the primitive technology and the degradation of time, they could hear it. The brilliance, the emotion, the sheer technical mastery that had made Thomas famous. And they began to ask, how could someone this talented have been forgotten? How could a story this important have been erased? The answer, of course, was uncomfortable. Thomas had been forgotten because his story was shameful. It revealed things about America that the country didn't want to confront. The exploitation, the racism, the casual cruelty with which disabled people were treated, the way legal systems could be weaponized to maintain oppression. It was easier to forget Thomas than to remember what had been done to him. In 1999, 91 years after Thomas's death, a group of historians, musicians, and activists raised money for a proper grave marker. They used old cemetery records and ground-penetrating radar to locate the approximate area where Thomas had been buried, and they erected a headstone. It reads, Thomas Blind Tom Wiggins, 1849 to 1908, musical genius, may his memory finally be honored. A small ceremony was held. A pianist played some of Thomas's original compositions pieces that had been silent for nearly a century. People spoke about his life, his extraordinary talents, his decades of suffering and exploitation. It was a small gesture, a gravestone and a ceremony. But it was acknowledgement. Recognition that Thomas Wiggins had existed, had mattered, had deserved better than he received. In the years since Thomas's story has slowly returned to public consciousness. Academic conferences have been held about his life and music. Concert pianists have recorded his original compositions. Books have been written for both adults and young readers. A documentary film was produced. His story has been taught in schools and universities as a case study in the intersection of genius, disability, race, and exploitation. In 2020, over a century after his death, a major recording label released an album of Thomas's compositions performed by a renowned classical pianist. The album received critical acclaim. Reviewers wrote that Thomas's music deserved to be recognized alongside the great composers of his era, that his contributions to American music had been unjustly forgotten. Today, if you search for Thomas Wiggins online, you'll find articles, videos, recordings, scholarly papers. His story is no longer lost. His name is no longer forgotten. But here's the thing. We must sit with, uncomfortable as it is, all of this recognition, all of this honor, all of these retrospectives and recordings and memorials and scholarly conferences. Thomas never experienced any of it. He lived his entire life being used. He died alone and forgotten. He spent 91 years in an unmarked grave while the world moved on without him. We cannot undo that. No amount of historical recognition can change the fundamental injustice of his existence. No gravestone, no matter how beautifully carved, can give back the childhood he never had, the freedom he was denied, the dignity he deserved. We can only bear witness, remember, and ask ourselves the hard questions about how we treat the vulnerable, the talented, the different among us. So here we are at the end of Thomas's story, or perhaps at the beginning of our understanding of what his story means. Thomas Wiggins was free for exactly 0 days of his life. Born a slave in 1849, he died in 1908, having spent every single day of those 59 years under someone else's control. The Emancipation Proclamation changed his legal status, but not his reality. The word freedom was written on documents, but he never experienced it in his life. His genius saved him from being sold or killed as a child. That same genius condemned him to a lifetime of exploitation. Think about that tragic irony. If Thomas had been ordinary, he might have lived an ordinary life. Hard, certainly, constrained by racism and poverty and disability, but ordinary, his own. Instead, his extraordinary gifts made him valuable, and being valuable in a system built on extraction and exploitation made him a target. The questions his life raises are profound and deeply uncomfortable. Who owns talent? If someone cannot advocate for themselves, who has the right to profit from their abilities? What does freedom mean when the free person has no power to exercise that freedom? How do we reconcile our celebration of genius with our complicity in the suffering of the genius? What is the difference between protection and possession, between guardianship and ownership, between opportunity and exploitation? Thomas played before presidents. Abraham Lincoln reportedly heard him perform and was moved to tears. Yet Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation didn't free Thomas in any meaningful way. Thomas generated wealth that would be worth tens of millions of dollars today. He died with nothing. Thomas was called the greatest musical mind of his generation. He was buried in an unmarked grave and forgotten for 91 years. Every paradox in his life points to a deeper truth about how society values people. We celebrate talent. We worship genius. We pay enormous sums to witness extraordinary abilities, but we often care very little about the human being who possesses those qualities. Thomas was a person who loved music, who found in piano keys a language more eloquent than words could ever be, who experienced the world through sound in ways we can barely imagine. But to most people who encountered him, he was a spectacle, a curiosity, a money-making opportunity, an interesting case study, a puzzle to be solved. And when he was no longer those things, when age and illness diminished his abilities, when the novelty wore off and the audiences dwindled, he became nothing. Invisible. Disposable. There's something else we need to acknowledge. Thomas's story is not unique. He's simply one of the few whose exploitation was documented enough to be recovered and told. How many other people with extraordinary talents were exploited? How many died unknown, their gifts buried with them because they had the misfortune of being born into bodies or circumstances that made them vulnerable? How many people right now in this moment are being used, their disabilities or circumstances making them vulnerable to those who see opportunity in their vulnerability? Thomas's legacy is not just his music, remarkable as it is. His legacy is a question we must ask ourselves over and over. Are we protecting the vulnerable, or are we using them? Are we celebrating genius while ignoring the humanity of the person who possesses it? Are we creating systems that allow exploitation to continue under different names with different legal frameworks, but the same essential cruelty? If you take one thing from Thomas's story, let it be this: genius does not justify exploitation. Talent does not justify enslavement. Difference does not justify abuse. Vulnerability does not excuse cruelty. Thomas Wiggins deserved better. He deserved to choose when and where he performed. He deserved to keep the money his talents generated. He deserved connection with his mother, with people who loved him for who he was, not what he could do. He deserved agency. dignity. Freedom in practice, not just on paper. He didn't get those things, and we cannot give them to him now. But we can honor his memory by refusing to repeat the pattern, by protecting those who cannot protect themselves, by valuing people as humans first, not as the sum of their usefulness to us. If Thomas could speak, if he could tell us what he wanted us to learn from his life, perhaps he would say this: listen to the music, but also listen to the silence between the notes. That's where the truth lives. That's where the person exists apart from the performance. See the whole human being, not just the talent, not just the disability, not just the value they might generate for you. The whole person. Thomas Wiggins, not Blind Tom, not the slave prodigy, not the musical curiosity, not the Negro genius. Just Thomas. A boy who was born blind into slavery. A boy who discovered that music was his native language, the one way he could speak to a world that otherwise made no sense to him. A man who played before thousands but died alone. A genius who earned fortunes for others but died with nothing. A person who deserved so much more than this world gave him. Remember him, not as a miracle, not as a curiosity, as a person whose life asks us to be better than the people who used him, a person whose story demands that we see exploitation for what it is, regardless of the legal frameworks or justifications we construct around it. That's the legacy, not the performances, not the genius, not the impossible abilities. The reminder that every person, no matter how different, no matter how vulnerable, no matter how extraordinary or how ordinary, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. That's what Thomas's life demands we remember. And perhaps if we remember it well enough, if we take it seriously enough, if we let it change how we see and treat vulnerable people in our own time, then his suffering won't have been entirely in vain. Thomas Wiggins's story is just one of countless forgotten histories. Stories of remarkable people who were erased, exploited, or ignored. Stories that deserve to be told and remembered. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it challenged you, or angered you, or broke your heart, there are more stories like this. More voices that need to be heard. More histories that need to be reclaimed. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss these important stories. Turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. If you want to honor Thomas's memory, here's how. The next time you see someone being celebrated for their talents, ask yourself, who's benefiting? Ask yourself if that person has real choice, real agency, real freedom. Ask yourself if they're being valued as a whole human being or just for what they can produce. Don't just applaud the performance. See the person behind it. That's what Thomas never got. But maybe if we remember him right, if we learn from his story, we can make sure others do. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering Thomas Wiggins. And please tell me in the comments, what struck you most about this story? What questions does it raise for you? How can we honor Thomas's memory by changing how we treat vulnerable people today? Your thoughts and your engagement keep these stories alive. Keep them from being buried again. Thomas deserves to be remembered, and so do all the others whose stories we haven't yet recovered. Let's make sure their voices are finally heard.